No longer the stuff of science fiction, incredible advances in artificial intelligence or AI are now a reality. As the technology surges ahead, we'll experience more of its impact on our lives. So what are the benefits and the risks? And can regulators keep pace with developers? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Just a few years ago, robots that could think for themselves, perform medical analysis, write essays or drive cars would have only existed in the realms of science fiction and fantasy. Now they're for real, part of the artificial intelligence revolution that will bring big changes to the way we live. To what extent is so far unknown, as an increasing number of innovations and inventions are rolled out. But whilst the pace of technology has stepped up rapidly and some delight in what's new, others are concerned high-tech is moving faster than is safe. So what is good and bad in artificial intelligence? And is it possible to regulate and control? We'll be asking our guests these and other questions in just a few moments. But first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
The rapid advancements of artificial intelligence tools such as ChatGPT-4 caused alarm this year, even from the tech leaders creating them. Analysts say AI has the potential to both transform our lives and threaten our extinction.
The current state of affairs, we're left kind of catching up by identifying harms after they've occurred. And it's really crucial in this moment that we see swift friction introduced that stops companies from, deploying systems into widespread use with, the public bearing the brunt of the harms.
The non-profit Centre for AI Safety lists some of the biggest risks. They include AI being used to develop advanced weapons, being abused by government bodies to monitor and censor citizens, and a more immediate risk, AI-generated misinformation that could destabilise society and interfere in elections.
I'm really worried that actually when we go into elections that social media is just going to be drowning in stories that are produced by AI, and we won't be able to tell what's real and what's fake anymore. We're not great at doing that now, but AI gives bad actors the possibility to do that on a completely unprecedented scale.
Governments are working to mitigate the risks with regulations to harness the benefits. AI's transformative powers are revolutionising medicine and science, making us more efficient and improving quality of life.
We saw last week, 2 weeks ago, from Google DeepMind that some of the AI system, recent ones, have been used for some mathematical discoveries. So I think the use of these systems in a proper, safe and ethical way hopefully can help us to resolve some of the unsolved scientific problems that are very important.
Artificial intelligence is developing as fast, if not faster, than governments' attempts to regulate it. The question is, can we keep up? Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's welcome our guests now. They're all real. In Cambridge, we have Henry Ajder, an expert on generative artificial intelligence and deepfake technology. He's an advisor to organisations like Meta. In Edinburgh is Lilian, Professor of Law, Innovation and Society at Newcastle University. And in Los Angeles, we have Ramesh Srinivasan, Professor of Media and Information Studies at the University of California and founder of the research group Digital Cultures Lab. Very warm welcome to all of you. Henry, let's start with the two broad schools of thought that we come to when we look at AI. Firstly, that it has a huge potential to transform our lives for the better. Secondly, that it threatens our very existence. Which one do you subscribe to?
Well, I'd like to think that we don't have to kind of choose these extreme poles in some respects. I think as with most things, these applications exist on a spectrum. And there are things that we can simultaneously be very excited about in the context of things like productivity, education, healthcare, and the like, whilst also acknowledging the very real risks that are posed to things like election integrity, women's rights, if we're talking about image abuse using things like deepfakes, and of course, cybersecurity scams, impersonation, and so on. So I think for me, the narrative often is a bit too sensational on one side or the other. It's either kind of AI zoom or AI doom. And for me, it's about kind of mapping the landscape as it is, recognizing the threats as they exist and tackling them, whilst also acknowledging that there is a lot of positive potential. And at the moment, I think we are really kind of existing in this quite polarized debate where we need a little bit more of the understanding of the kind of the dual use nature of AI.
OK. Ramesh, how are you already seeing AI impact our world?
Yeah, I mean, there are very significant impacts that these types of AI systems, so-called generative AI systems, are already having, because I think it's very important we all note how these systems work. They mimic human expression and human behavior. They do so in absolutely remarkable ways because we have such powerful pattern computing, pattern storing, pattern matching technologies, right? Because the cost of storing data and essentially datafying everything has become so much cheaper, and we've built machines to induce those patterns. So that's very helpful in the context of things like environmental monitoring, or as your story just indicated, questions around science and medicine. But as far as sort of doom scenarios or my concerns, which are, corporate overreach, bias issues, algorithmic violence issues, all of these are things that we're treating as inevitable, even though we're constructing the inevitable. So I think we need to ask a bigger question, which is, what should we not datafy? What should we not let loose to calculating machines, and who truly has power, governance, and oversight over systems of all kinds that are increasingly taking over our world and our planet.
OK, and Lilian, would you agree with that? Is data one of the key areas of concern here? What are you focused on most when you're looking at the future of AI?
Yeah, I think anyone looking at the future of AI is focused on data. I mean, fundamentally, it's data, models, and compute. That's the things in play here, and I suppose labor resources. I would go back actually to Henry's reply, because I think he was being more diplomatic than I would be. But a lot of this year has been spent countering really a kind of radical semi-religious opinion that the main threat from AI is existential threat to future generations, as in AI will kill us all. And there is little to no evidence that we are anywhere near this. When you start to try, as I did actually on Twitter, when you start to try and look for the proof of this, you generally find that you're referred to various quotes from various interviews by various of the leaders of this movement, as opposed to actual scientific rigorous evidence. And I think all the panelists will know that current AI, including large models, is fundamentally just, it's a pattern matching next word predictive generator type technology. It doesn't resemble human intelligence in any form, as far as we know. And therefore, what we need to do, I think, is spend more time focusing on the current threats or the near future threats, which have already been mentioned: deepfakes, bias in decision-making, environmental threats, propaganda, fake news. There are so many, and stop wasting our energy on made-up future risks.
OK, yeah, that is interesting. If you are going to look, Henry, at the current situations, and we've mentioned deepfakes a number of times already, misinformation is a key issue that is cropping up time and time again. How concerning is misinformation in an era of social media, in an era where we're all glued to our phones, and in an era where we have already seen it have influence on major events such as elections?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been studying and researching deepfakes for 6 years, and every midterm or presidential election in the US, I will get asked, is this going to be the one where we see a real impact of deepfakes, causing a state to vote in a certain pattern or even swing the entire result? And until recently, I've been somewhat dismissive based on the evidence we've been seeing, which is that there's been very little in the way of deepfake disinformation or interference, and a lot in the way of kind of cheap fake, that is kind of more crude media manipulation, out of context images, slowed down voice audio, and things like this. However, this year has been pretty transformative in terms of both the capabilities that are now available in terms of things of text to image, synthetic voice generation, and so on, but also critically the democratization of those tools. They are now incredibly accessible. And we're already seeing, a lot of political deepfakes on social media, on places like TikTok, which are satirical, often absurd, but then we also have started to see some that are kind of creeping into that more kind of sinister disinformation sphere. And with the year ahead, holding, I think 76 countries have elections next year, about a quarter of the world's population, I have no doubt that we will see some attempts to use deepfakes in these elections. We've seen it already in places such as Slovakia, where fake voice audio of the candidate who ended up losing went viral on Telegram. Again, it's not clear how much of an impact that had, but it certainly seems to have had some. But I guess there's a lot of assumptions going around that, deepfakes are incredibly persuasive in a way that kind of text-based fake news or disinformation is not. And the research is really out on this at the moment. We don't know fully how much more powerful these kind of AI-powered disinformation tools are. Some initial research suggested there's a marginal improvement, but I think it's right to be concerned, but at the moment we don't have that evidence base to say that, look, deepfakes have this capability to really have the impact, even if they are deployed quite widely.
Okay, I mean, Ramesh, isn't part of the problem of that we're seeing already highlighted in the discussion is that there's so much we don't know, and the technology is moving so fast. Developers are doing stuff that we have no clue about, and there's very little regulation put in place so far to catch up with it.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, as far as disinformation concerns, as Henry alluded to, this is already a challenge on major technology platforms, social media platforms. Certainly, we saw many concerns in previous elections involving Meta/Facebook. We see concerns involving X, as we've spoken about several times on Al Jazeera regarding, and this is partly because these platforms are not truly governed by the public, right? They're not truly governed by the demos, at least in the context of elections or electoral issues, let alone the concerns that your other guest mentioned, which I very much agree with, around the health of an economy where all of our own personal data and an internet that we all paid for is being basically monetized by corporate actors that have not really shown a lot of sense of, allegiance to the public realm. So what I think the much more interesting and important question, rather than kind of going, all gonzo on the next technology and then the next technology and the next technology, is asking the big questions of how we wish to live on this planet. What should not be datafied? How do we truly ensure that democracy and a more equal economy governs and drives these technologies? So those social human questions are so much more important and so much more challenging in a way than just going writ large with technologies that are being totally dominated by private corporations that don't necessarily have much allegiance to third parties like states and so on, unless they're pushed to do so.
So, Ramesh, what do you think should not be dataized then?
That's a great question. So I think, first of all, many aspects of our own sort of personal lives, we should always have an opt-out of personal data be the default, but in many parts of the world, opt-in is the default, including in the United States. I think we should be regulating data brokers, which, again, the European Union is doing a better job of, and we should have third-party audit of what data is being retained for how long, how these algorithms tend to drive more extremist content that is already rampant on all of these platforms. So those are issues that already exist independent or connected to the emergence of generative AI systems like ChatGPT. And those are the kinds of issues we need to protect. We need to protect the integrity of all of us as citizens and ensure that there are guardrails so we actually have a more equitable, fairer world. And I think technology can take us there, but we have to start with those values.
Lilian, do you already feel that you share more data than you're comfortable with?
I'm not sure I do, but I want to sort of take issue and represent, as it were, the European perspective, even though I'm in the UK, which very sadly is not part of the EU anymore. Because, of course, I totally agree that what we're going through is a social revolution just as much as a technological revolution. And we should be looking at social solutions, such as, for example, we might talk about universal basic income for creative laborers or other kinds of laborers, workers who might lose or have their jobs diminished by this technology. But primarily, I'm here as a lawyer, and I would say this is not the Wild West, and it's even less the Wild West at the end of a year of ChatGPT. In Europe, all the challenges that we just talked about were really a cusp turning point. They are being addressed. This is not just something in the far future. This is most of the world, actually, except the US is addressing these challenges. Of course, many of these Gen AI providers, OpenAI, Google, etc., are based in the US, so that's an issue. But they do have to sell into the rest of the world. I mean, the EU is the world's second largest trading bloc, and therefore that generally means, unless they're small out there scammer type enterprises, that they do want to accord with European law. And in Europe, forever, really, well, for a very long time, we've had something called data protection law, general data protection regulation, which I'm sure has been discussed on Al Jazeera, which does guarantee almost everything that was just mentioned, right? Transparency as to what data is being collected about you, restrictions on how it's reprocessed.
I guess one of the problems, going to jump in, Lilian, because I think one of the problems is many of us choose not to go through all of that list of stuff as being used on us, and we choose not to opt out, or we just don't. We miss it when we log into an app. This is on to us, but I think what Ramesh was saying. Is it not better to have the opt-out as a default rather than the opt-in as a default?
Well, yes, it would be. But what I'm saying is that that's not really the be-all and end-all of the discussion, right? We've actually moved in Europe very much past the idea that you can consent to anything in situations where you have no choice, right? I mean, if you take Facebook, young people don't want to be on Facebook anymore, but take old people, right? For many situations, everyone kind of has to be on Facebook, right? It's one of the ways you get jobs. It's one of the ways you make networks. It's one of the ways you keep your voluntary associations going. And you can say, yeah, we consent to giving you all our data to monetize it because we want to join Facebook. Well, Europe is beginning to say, in fact, is saying that's not valid. Right, that's not real consent. And it is changing. And very shortly, really very shortly, within the next 5 years, probably that business model is going to be illegal in Europe. And what, the likes of Meta and so forth will do about it is right up for grabs right now. Right? Are they going to have to approach a different kind of advertising? Are they going to have to go to a subscription model? Are they going to do some combination of all of these things? So we're really moving past that point in Europe, and a great deal of the rest of the world. That remains now a very American perspective.
OK, Henry, EU really is leading the way, isn't it, in regulation? It's just recently passed the AI Act. What impact is that going to have, though, on the development of AI within Europe?
Well, I think Lilian's certainly right that the EU has huge influence over development around the world based on the regulations that it enforces within its own borders, I guess you could say. We saw that, for example, with Apple, with the new iPhone moving to a USB-C port over the Lightning port that they've used, and that was something that the EU more or less forced into action. But I must say, I do feel that, the kind of the landscape around regulation of AI is a really interesting one, because we're seeing countries in particular kind of grappling with this dilemma between, well, do we kind of adopt what some people would say is a pro-innovation approach, which is perhaps a little bit lighter on regulation to avoid what people in industry would refer to as kind of regulatory capture, stifling innovation, whilst also taking seriously the risks to their society, to individuals' rights and so on. And to me, it's at the moment, I think there's quite a few countries that are sort of trying to wait and see what happens. And the EU AI Act is a really interesting one, because obviously that's not come into force yet. It's not being actually, deployed. It looks like it won't be until probably the end of next year, if I understand correctly. And so, yeah, I think we have this really interesting dynamic, which is we live in a world now where a lot of this information, and particularly software, is freely available online in a lot of cases, particularly in the open source space, which is a huge debate around AI. And, a lot of countries, I think, are trying to sort of kind of get that balance right. But a lot of countries, I think, are actually kind of trying to go more pro-innovation to attract investment, to kind of cement their reputation as the leaders in this space. And I think the EU AI Act will be an interesting kind of first mark. It's worth saying as well, though, for example, though China has put in place, even at the beginning of this year, the Deep Synthesis Act. It's got some fairly broad sweeping AI regulation in place already as well. So it's not just the EU that's moved first on this.
Okay.
I think, if I may just quickly, I think, Ramesh raised some interesting points about kind of the societal impact and kind of the big questions around datafication, what we do and don't want to be datafied. And for me, there are some other really interesting questions that emerge off the back of AI, which I think are really important, such as, for example, AI romantic chatbots, virtual kind of partners and things like this. The film Her is increasingly becoming a reality. The role of synthetic resurrection, bringing back deceased actors in Hollywood and so on. There's a lot of really kind of ethically ambiguous grey questions that make us feel uncomfortable. And we don't really know if that discomfort, is kind of an intuition of ethical, things going wrong, or if it's just future shock. So I think next year we're going to see quite a lot of these sort of strange applications being debated quite hotly in the context of, should this be legislated against? How do we kind of govern some of these slightly more strange and unsettling use cases?
Ramesh, do you agree with that? Do you think there's going to be quite a lot of odd things coming out in the next year, things that don't sit quite comfortably with us?
Right. I mean, I don't think there's any question that these oddities are more and more a thing of the present and of the future. My friend and colleague Kevin Roos was able to get ChatGPT to ask him to leave his wife in a well-known story, that came out a few months ago. And I think the European Union has led the way with interesting reforms on certain levels, though there's been little in terms of true algorithmic audit. And also Instagram, which is owned by Meta, is a dominant platform used by younger people. So never think about the technology itself as much as the corporate governance of such, which different technologies are used by different demographics. I also think there's widespread concern around where the economy is heading, this datafied economy. I mean, we see large-scale youth unemployment in parts of Southern Europe. We have concerns around what type of innovation is actually pro-labor, is actually lifting young people up and creating a more equitable data economy. And I think most importantly, the vast majority of people around the planet, though I appreciate the optimism of my colleagues, and the vast majority of people around the planet implicated by emerging technologies are in the global south, right? They're in South Asia, South America. There are some examples of privacy law or other types of legislation, but many of these are one-offs or piecemeals. So to sort of say that we're sort of heading in a sort of economically just, democratically, focused direction on a planetary level is a big myth. But I think that we can get there. I think the question is how do we wish our digital and datafied world to be, and what is the role of this type of artificial intelligence? Mind you, completely different than artificial intelligence systems I and others had worked on in the past, which were more interested in rationality, human cognition. But as we know, as humans, there's many other types of intelligence, as was alluded to. We have emotional intelligence, there are non-human types of intelligence, and at times we're just plain irrational as human beings. So this is not really about mimicking, it's about emergent pattern recognition systems, as your guests have pointed out.
One of the key areas that AI certainly can't access, Lilian, at the moment is creativity, compassion, love. Even if you do have romantic chatbots, they don't quite hit the mark, do they? And AI cannot fully understand human language. What limits does that then bring? And will it one day maybe overcome those limits?
Well, I don't think I'm the one to ask if it can overcome those limits. I'm skeptical about it, but I'm not a computer scientist. I think that the impact, what we're seeing, one of the earliest huge impacts is, I mean, we've already talked a lot about misinformation. I think the other major impact right now is on the creative industries, where there is enormous worry and some despair. I think, again, what we've had is a year of the Wild West, as it were, settling down, okay? So we started with, let's scrape everything on the internet, including everybody's books and everybody's drawings and all the rest of it, and stick them into our models and make money, Okay, that model is now, I think the zeitgeist is moving, as I said on Twitter or X. I think that model is now becoming unsustainable. We have a lot of litigation going on out there. Notably, in the last couple of days, the New York Times has launched a very, very solid lawsuit against OpenAI concerning their use of its material, its stories, and pointing out some of them being reproduced almost entirely. We've seen that narrative already with images, with Getty, who pointed again to Getty images being reconstructed complete with logo. The really interesting thing about the New York Times suit is that it has resulted from a breakdown in licensing negotiations. In other words, OpenAI weren't offering New York Times enough money. So we are shifting, I think, from a paradigm, which again is very, sorry to be so localist, but is very sort of American, to free use, fair use of anything that's out there, to an idea that this is just like anything else, like licensing music, like licensing your book to become a film play, that there has to be a negotiation on licensing with rights holders.
Okay, Lilian, I'm just going to jump in there because I can see Ramesh shaking his head on that point. And I'll come to you, Henry, in just a moment. Just let Ramesh quickly jump in.
No, I very much appreciate the comments, and it's a good point about the New York Times. But I think that, remember, it's not just the data of the Wall Street Journal, which ChatGPT was partly trained on, or the New York Times, that is at stake here. And of course, my friends at the Writers Guild of America had major concerns about generative AI taking their own copyrighted content. But it's all of our data, right? It's all of us. And most importantly, it's not just the European Union that's emerging out of the Wild West. The internet is, largely speaking, the Wild West still on corporate platforms around the planet. So for me, this is really a question of all of us, 99% of us around the planet, especially you think about people in the African continent that are increasingly colliding with these technologies, and just ensuring that we have systems in place where these technological breakthroughs that are driven by and for private corporations using all of our personal data and an internet we all paid for, lift all of us up. And I don't know if it's merely universal basic income. It could be another way of thinking about labor of the future, employment of the future, a more win-win.
I'm just going to jump in there because we've only got a minute left. And Henry, I'm sorry, but I'm going to end with another binary question for you. Is the year ahead, 2024, should it be a year of caution in the field of AI or a year of excitement?
Yeah, I'm gonna refuse your question and say I think again it's both. I don't think you have to be one or the other. I just very quickly also want to say, you asked earlier, AI is not creative, AI cannot love. On one level, maybe that's a philosophically interesting question. On a face value question, it may not be creative, but it's replacing creative people's jobs. It may not be able to love, but it might be able to romance a new generation of young men. And so whether it is or not doesn't necessarily change the impact it's having on the related spaces. So I think, that's a kind of an interesting philosophical question, but the impact is very real, and it will be going into next year, both in exciting and terrifying ways, no doubt.
I love it. I love ending on a philosophical answer. Thanks very much to all of us for joining us today, to all of you for joining us today. Henry, Ajder, Lilian, Edwards and Ramesh Srinivasan. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.